Bernie Sanders is shifting his tone a bit on the war in Gaza, coming out with a statement calling Netanyahu's war, quote, we can put this up here, illegal, immoral, brutal, and grossly disproportionate. He says Congress must reject any effort to pass $10 billion of unconditional military aid for the right-wing Netanyahu government. Longer statement up there if you want to pause it and read it. Krystal, let's unpack this a little bit. First, the obvious point. He has yet to call for a ceasefire. One of the things that people have always loved about Bernie is his consistency and his stubbornness. And
I think it plays in the other direction, though.
His stubbornness, I'd be surprised if he goes to his grave never calling for the word ceasefire. He might say the fire should cease, but he's not going to let the left pressure him into saying a ceasefire. He will call the war illegal, grossly disproportionate, immoral, and brutal. But he's just not going to go there and say those words. Which, whatever, we're not here to like make Bernie Sanders say magical words because they're not going to actually, do anything. How significant is this, though? Let's say, short of calling for a ceasefire, how significant is it for him to call for blocking the $10 billion and to call the war illegal? Because that's calling for a ceasefire because nobody supports an illegal war. He just won't say the words.
He just won't say the words, which is frustrating. I mean, it is frustrating because just at this point, really, how many we're up, according to Euromed Monitor,
also,
over 30,000
one point on that, not me, us, is undermined if your ego won't let you go with the us.
Very true. That is very true. I do think, so it's complicated because on the one hand, you're like, number one, what took you so freaking long to have this level of upset over what has been clear from day one? I mean, Bernie Sanders is not naive about who Benjamin Netanyahu is. He's not naive about what the current Israeli government is or about really what successive Israeli governments have been moving towards for decades now, because I also don't want to give the impression that Netanyahu is some outlier in Israeli society right now. He's not. I mean, if anything, in Israeli society, he is kind of a moderate, which is terrifying. His government, however, is the most extreme in history. Bernie is not ignorant of any of these facts. So it was always clear from day one that the response was going to be a horror. And the statements that were made from the Israeli government, in case you were in any doubt, you could just listen to their own comments. The siege, the complete medieval siege, denying millions of people food, water, medical care, fuel, etc. That was announced as official government policy. So to not see it for what it was from day one was preposterous. Then, of course, you have the specter of somewhere around, the numbers vary a little bit, but around 80% of the deaths being innocent civilians, which also was incredibly predictable in a densely populated enclave where a majority of people are kids. So that was not surprising either. But for it to have taken this long to even put out this statement is immensely frustrating. However, you want to say, okay, good. I'm glad you finally are seeing it at least somewhat like what the overwhelming majority of the world, and certainly the overwhelming majority of your supporters, the way that they see this thing. And I do think it's significant because he is a United States senator. And, an individual senator, as you know better than I do, has a significant amount of power. You now have a situation where the Biden administration is trying to put together these three pieces: Ukraine aid, border funding, and additional aid to Israel. And the idea is in the new year when Congress comes back that this is going to be a top priority. And so if you have Bernie Sanders really trying to muck up the works on that whole thing and taking an adamant stance against it, I do think that actually does have some significance. Yeah.
It's been a real drag on the anti-war push to have to drag the most left-wing senator to this position. And I think,
at AIPAC.
Right.
That we're like, look at Bernie Sanders making the case against a ceasefire, which was grotesque to see.
Yeah, and your point to single out his use of the phrase, the right-wing Netanyahu government as a way to kind of distance the entire project from this and to try to pin it on Netanyahu, I think is relevant here, and to show how far he had to travel. There was a clip from early November where he was on cable television and was asked about a ceasefire. Let's roll this and then unpack it.
I want to just clarify one thing, Senator, if I might. You support a humanitarian pause in Gaza. Some of your fellow progressives say that there should be a full-on ceasefire, which would require an agreement on both sides to halt the fighting. Do you support a ceasefire? And if not, why not?
Well, I don't know how you can have a ceasefire, permanent ceasefire, with an organization like Hamas, which is dedicated to turmoil and chaos and destroying the state of Israel. And I think what the Arab countries in the region understand, that Hamas has got to go.
Right, so that's 2 months ago.
Yeah.
At this point. What I found so interesting about that response from him is that a kind of left-wing senator analysis of that same situation would say, okay, yes, sure, yes, Hamas is founded with genocidal intent towards Israel, but Hamas and the occupation are mutually reinforcing kind of dysfunctional elements. You could just as easily and kind of more persuasively say
Yes.
that how can you ever have a permanent ceasefire with one party militarily occupying another party? Like that's not a ceasefire. And even if the occupation doesn't involve kind of shooting civilians for a period of several hours or several days, an occupation is still done by force. And there had been hundreds of civilians killed just in the West Bank.
That's right.
Before October 7th.
That's right.
And
those
so,
get ignored, though, in this whole ceasefire conversation.
Right. You keep hearing AIPAC in particular say one of their big talking points is there was a ceasefire on October 6th. No, there's been an ongoing war, which involves an occupation. That's not a ceasefire.
To make it entirely clear, the greatest threat to Hamas and the greatest threat to Israeli extremists is de-escalation and peace.
Yeah.
That is the greatest threat to Hamas. And that's not theoretical. When you look at polling of Palestinians throughout history, when there was some peaceful process to be engaged with, where there was some reasonable hope and expectation that it would result in some kind of a settlement, not even what I would call a just settlement, but some kind of a settlement, support for groups like Hamas, armed resistance groups like Hamas, decreases. When those pathways are all closed, guess what? Support for violence increases. And we're seeing it right now. I mean, this idea that, by inflicting a shock on the civilian population, they're going to turn on Hamas and that's how we're going to get them out. It's preposterous. This has literally never happened in history, that bombing the hell out of a civilian population causes them to turn on whoever there is governing them.
Right.
No, it causes them to be hardened in their actual support, to rally around the flag. This is what we saw in the bombings in Britain during the World War II. This is what we saw in the Allied bombings of Dresden and other places in Germany in World War II. We have seen this throughout history. So it's a preposterous idea. And, I don't know, I don't want to psychoanalyze Bernie. It seems to me that, and this is not to make excuses either, he's like a product of his generation on this. Because if you look at the polling, the older you are, the more likely you are to see things through this binary of Israel's good and the Palestinians are bad, and that's that. And so it just seems to me like he has been incredibly corrupted by the propaganda that he has been exposed to throughout his life, and is much more similar to his own generational cohort than he is to the younger base that, overwhelmingly supports him and most of his ideas.
Yeah. And your point that peace is the real risk to these extremists, both in the Israeli government and Hamas, is so important and needs to be underscored. There have been idiots within kind of Hamas who thought that violent attacks against Israeli civilians would cause the Israeli public to turn against the occupation. Like there were people who made that argument. Absurd,
right? Immoral,
unethical, disgusting, like gross, and also tactically incorrect. Like it unifies the country. We've seen it before, though, when the ANC was launching kind of terror attacks against the apartheid South African government. The white Afrikaners said, if we give in to the ANC, if we give in to these terror attacks, then all the black people are going to organize through ANC and kill all the white people in South Africa. But instead, after apartheid was torn down, the violent militant wing of the ANC had no reason to exist anymore and just faded away. The IRA was told the same thing, that if we give in to the IRA, that they're going to take out violent retribution against the British because of what the British have been doing for thousands of years to the Irish. The depth of the hatred between both religious and ethnic is so deep that it's going to lead to endless violence so we just have to keep our boot on the neck of the IRA. As soon as the war ends and there's dignity and peace, the reason to be in the militant wing of Sinn Féin just evaporates.
Yeah.
And you have some splinter groups that just are defined by their need to be violent, but that they're just tiny little elements that fade away, and within a couple generations, that they're completely gone. And also, people age out. That's the other thing people don't understand. Participating in that sort of violence is a thing you do in your teens and 20s for the most part, and that if you can get to a place where you can just live a normal life, that's what most people want, and that's why you don't have bombings in Dublin anymore or in South Africa.
And to ignore that analysis is to make the case, which unfortunately many do, that Arabs, Palestinians, Muslims are somehow different.
Just inherently violent.
They're just
subhuman,
inherently
barbaric.
It's yes, it's in their DNA, which is obviously a wrong and blatantly racist view, which again, unfortunately, is all too common and pervades so much of the thinking on this conflict, and is how the news media is typically able to get away with these completely dehumanizing statements about Palestinians, a coverage of Palestinian atrocities. How we just had one of the deadliest attacks, which is really saying something in all of this war. I think there were roughly 200 Palestinians killed in this one attack in Gaza. You may not have even heard about it. It was a footnote. Imagine if that was Israelis. Imagine if it was any, Europeans. Imagine if it was here, God forbid. This would be front page news for months and months and months, and justify apparently all sorts of atrocities being committed. But since it's Palestinians, it's barely a blip on the radar.
Right, and there are 2 million Arab Israeli civilians, and they're not blowing things up all over the place. There's nothing inherent in being Arab.
That's a great point. They're the same people.
It's the oppression, right? Yeah, it's just they live on different sides of the fence.
Hey guys, if you like that video, go to breakingpoints.com, become a premium subscriber, and help us build the best independent media organization on the planet.
That's right. We're subscriber funded. We're building something new. We want to replace these failing mainstream media organizations.
So again, to subscribe, it's breakingpoints.com.